Welcome. Good morning. It is April 15th. Happy Tax Day, everyone. House Healthcare, and we are hearing from Representative Ann Donahue on an amendment that she is offering on S27. So welcome. Tell us about your amendment.
Thank you. Ann Donahue from Northfield. And I don't know, you don't need to see it if you haven't seen it. It's pretty straightforward. It's proposing striking the term behavioral health from the definition. And, you know, I had been following the fact that that term was in there from the start and I had talked with Jenny Lyons about it, who said, yeah, it was total oversight. They don't use that term, but she hadn't noticed it there in their process. And I also knew from following it that, you know, you'd had two witnesses who testified about the term. Chief healthcare advocate who said, not needed, it's offensive, not respectful, suggests we delete it. And then from Voss saying, support the removal of it, you know, just do it. So when I tried to go back and listen to tapes, actually, I didn't hear any other discussion, or I didn't locate any other discussion. So that's why I was pretty stunned when I saw the bill voted out without it being removed. And I did go on further afterwards and later found a discussion about S28, where you were looking at the same definition, and where there was discussion about why the committee believed that it was necessary to leave it in, despite the testimony from the two folks from the healthcare field, and despite your own discussion and recognition of it being seen as stigmatizing and harmful. There's a lot to say, and we don't have a lot of time, so I'm just going to catch a few of the highlights. I know there was reference to, you know, well, the federal agencies use it. And every single federal agency that uses it, actually, it's pretty clear in their context that they're using it simply as the same term as a substitute for the term mental health and substance use disorder. That's the Agency of Health and Human Services, the CDC, CMS in its discussions and in its grant initiatives, SAMHSA, the National Institute of Mental Health, and then various other national organizations. But I think, you know, the real key for this committee, as I heard and understood it from the YouTubes, is the perception that it's essential to use it in this bill because this is, quote, an outward-facing bill outside of Vermont. The desire that for a healthcare services description that's as broad as possible, so that there aren't any loopholes for a credit reporting agency to take advantage of, saying, well, this is a debt for behavioral health services, not mental health, substance use disorder services that you've listed in the bill. So therefore, the need to incorporate any terms that somebody else could use that might have a broader meaning and include something than what would be just mental health and substance use disorder. So that kind of leads to the fundamental question. You know, if nobody can actually give a definitive definition of behavioral health because it's defined many different ways or very many different permutations, some as broad as saying any kind of health behavior. Is there a way that we can be assured that we don't leave something out when we're trying to be all incorporated? And I think one of the most basic, what the World Health Organization called common language around the world that identifies, you know, every provider in every state everywhere uses to classify conditions and to bill insurance, which is the International Classification of Diseases, the ICD. And if you go through them, there are 99 different ones that come under the title mental, behavioral, and neurodevelopmental disorders. But there isn't a single, the list of what they go, there isn't a single one there that includes something including the term behavioral that is not something that's directly linked as being a psychological factor that affects a physical disorder. And the directive actually says you code it first under the physical disorder, and then you also use this code. So it's covered, in other words, under medical services, because the things that some use of the umbrella term behavioral health uses that might not be in mental health and substance abuse use services are all incorporated in a medical service. There's no gap within the use of those. There's nothing that falls between the cracks if you're using both of those, both medical services and mental health and substance use disorders services. Medicaid itself, directly, CMS says behavioral health services are not a defined category of Medicaid benefits. They all come under one of those other categories that are already identified in the bill through the language medical services and through the language mental health substance use disorder. It's not a service category of its own. It's simply an umbrella term for assorted types of services that are all identified in one of those other categories. The rationale to include it, as I understand, it was the concern that there would be this potential missing area. And, all of the research, all of the evidence makes it really, really clear. There is no other missing area. There is nothing that is not captured in medical, mental health, and substance use disorder. That's some discrete thing that would only be covered if you use the term behavioral health. So, I think from the conversation, you had an understanding about why it would be harmful. I can talk more about that if people are not familiar, but why it is so harmful, why it is so stigmatizing, why it disparages a disability community, and harms all of the reasons that stigma is so detrimental to healthcare services as a whole. It's negative towards the importance of parity, that this is not just not a real illness. It's harmful to stigma remains the single largest reason that people don't seek help. And so if we use terminology that enhances the stigma, we're creating a really harmful negative effect. So if it doesn't offer any protection for the purpose of the bill, we really need to take it out.
Thank you, ma'am. I'm sorry, Representative Donovan. Does anyone have any questions?
I don't have a question. I just want to say that it bothers me too. And I think that your feelings are valid about it, for what it's worth.
All right.
I can see and feel and understand the harm, and you're correct. The bulk of the conversation, the discussion that we had was felt like an impossible situation, where we also needed to protect another very vulnerable group from forces larger than us that are causing unpredictable and real harm.
So by deleting behavioral, we're not leaving anyone out of this medical debt relief. Is that correct?
That is correct from all of the definitions, all of the, and I'd say there isn't time to go through them all. And I think that's why Mike Fisher and Devin Green both said, you don't need this.
I think that, Mike Fisher and Devin Green, as it pertains to within the state of Vermont, I don't think we need this, and we had discussion on this. I personally am committed to anytime we have any bill as it pertains to the state of Vermont, we will not include this. But on the advice of legislative counsel, by removing it, we're opening up outside entities from their own interpretation. You mentioned in what you were just saying is that behavioral health has such a loosely defined, inconsistent definition and uses by all sorts of agencies, states, medical societies, psychological societies, our federal government. And I think the reason, for just that reason, the vagueness of the term is what leaves it so open for interpretation. I don't ever want someone who had medical debt for whatever the diagnosis code may be on it for cognitive behavioral therapy. I don't want some credit reporting agency saying, oh, this was for behavioral health, not exempt. Because also what is stigmatizing is medical debt.
I do understand that. And I think, that's sort of the whole issue. Because it's so vague, it doesn't really tell you anything. What tells you something is the actual facts, the actual healthcare information, all of those statements of the federal agency. It's one thing to say, well, this term could mean this or could mean that. But if somebody were to try to use that as a loophole, they could pull anything out of the hat for the loophole, but they can't sustain that as a loophole because the facts are contrary. And I just have to, legislative counsel can speak for herself, but the legal interpretation of what something might do is absolutely the expertise of legislative counsel. But that is being provided based on an interpretation of something that is a healthcare expertise, a healthcare resource expertise, not a legal issue. And you didn't have any testimony at all from a healthcare source about whether or not behavioral health captures anything under the sun that is not captured under mental health or substance use. And all of the evidence is there is nothing under the sun that is not captured by one of those terms.
Brian?
So I've been reading while you're talking, the ICD and thinking about this, and I do agree with your point. I think any condition in those 99 diagnoses, a clinician, if asked, could make the argument that they're covered under all these other words without behavioral health. I also noticed they use the term emotional, which in a section where they say behavioral and emotional disorders, and we don't specify emotional disorders. And so I'm just saying, it's interesting that we would pick behavioral out, but not emotional. So, and that's referring to codes F90 to F98, which are behavioral and emotional disorders with onset usually occurring in childhood and adolescence, which at this point, most clinicians would look at these and say these are outdated because like we don't usually use conduct disorder anymore because it's understood now that those are related to trauma. And even ADHD is being increasingly looked at as a form of neurodivergence versus some kind of sickness that people have. So I'm just looking at this, realizing how behind our system is from practice, even like the language of the system is actually, but I'm speaking as a healthcare provider, and that really isn't my role right now. I just want to validate that I've been taking this seriously and also trying to put aside my own feelings about the word because I don't like it. But now as I'm reading it, I'm like, you have a good point, which is why are we picking that word when these are all mental illnesses, technically? So we need to call it behavioral.
I mean, I think having healthcare professional testimony would be what would be critical if there was a belief that there's something missing. Because there's nothing in any of the medical journals, there's nothing in any of the federal definitions that would suggest that there's anything missing.
Yeah, I'd also like to point out that we don't say intellectual or developmental disorders, and that's also a category that's specifically listed in this section of the ICD-10. So,
What do you mean by that, Brian?
01 to 99.
yeah, so in the ICD-10, there's Representative Donahue referred to diagnostic categories, and I pulled it up and was reading through them, and 70 to 79 are called intellectual disabilities, and so F70 would be mild, then it's moderate, severe, but we don't mention, and then it says first you need to code any physical or developmental disorders. So what it's basically saying in that same section where behavioral is used in the F0 to 99, it uses the term developmental disorder and intellectual disability, and we don't list those as something covered for medical debt. But I could make the argument if I had to before like a fair hearing board that they're covered, yeah, by the existing.
I would just point out really quickly that ICD-10 is recommendations for order of codes is based upon the billing of it. And
Yeah.
Well, that's not according to the World Health Organization.
So I want to bring this back around to the bill, which is on medical debt. And I have worked, I no longer work, but I worked in the credit reporting agency for 30 years. My first job there was actually in customer service when people called in and tried to get things removed from their credit report. It is really, really hard for a consumer to get something removed from their credit report. And where I completely understand where you're coming from, Rep. Donahue, I also think this bill is about, as Rep. Black said, about the people who are dealing with medical debt. And from my experience, I think it's important that we do try to be inclusive as possible to help those people who need to remove it, and hope that things like the language coming out of the World Organization will make its way into the relationship between a creditor and a credit reporting agency. But right now it's not. So I'd like us to keep our eyes on the bill's intent itself.
thank you. I forgot you worked for a credit reporting agency. Lori.
That was going to be my point as well. Not having worked in a credit reporting agency, the people that are going to be making the decisions here are not the people that we've been talking about this morning. We've been talking about medical professionals and some billing issues within the medical world, but we're talking about credit agencies and looking at this problem, who's actually going to be making the decisions? It's not, yes, we can work with the medical community to correct the terminology and remove stigmatizing language, but that's not where the focus of this bill is. The bill is focusing on protecting people from the harm that is caused by people and institutions like credit reporting agencies that do cause real harm, and they will find any way to exclude a person. Just as we know, some insurance companies regularly try to exclude people and deny coverage. So I support the general removal of the phrase behavioral wherever possible, and especially in the medical community and when we're talking about care and treatment of individuals, but that's not what this bill is about.
Albert, did you have a question?
No.
Comment? Okay, go ahead. I appreciate so much, Rep. Donahue, your tenacity with this term and just not only your work and contributions to the field. I greatly admire you and look up to you. And in many ways, you inspired me to run for office because of your contributions to law in Vermont. And continuing to have discussions like this that teach us all more about how deeply, how much further we have to go. I just really appreciate it. But I think, you know, as someone also struggling with mental health challenges, I also differ from you in many ways, and that is in this term. I also dislike it. I think it's a terrible way to refer to people like us. However, I want to further this field and broaden the conversation with people that speak different languages than us. So I do not agree that we should prohibit the use of the term, because I want to broaden the conversation. I want to have this conversation with people from the medical field. I want people to pay for these services who speak that language in the essence of integration, right? That's where the term came from, is people wanting to see substance use.
The term came from insurers.
Payers who wanted to see substance use and mental health coming
Wanted
together.
to avoid it, wanted to avoid.
And I appreciate that they came up with a term that allowed those people who are far from the people who are actually experiencing the issues. And so in that essence, I don't want to prohibit those conversations and I want to keep them going. But I agree with Mari and Lori that just because of the nature of the bill and the intent of it, I think in this instance, we need to protect the people and keep it in. And thank you again for bringing the issue and the conversation around.
I appreciate that. I hope that my presentation on the floor today will help in that educational process. I
know it's,
need to go into a lot of detail because, you know,
I just want
it
to
wasn't taken.
share another piece of evidence to just further complicate things a little bit. Like, sorry, but it's the nature of it. And I think it's important to just for me to talk about it here. So on the floor, I can stay out of this, other people engage. That they're just to show people the level of problematicness, but then also why I see the side of the committee is because like eating disorders are coded here as behavioral syndromes associated with physiological disturbances and physical factors. And so I could see, first of all, I think that's offensive to view it that way and to even code it that way. And then you read how they define them. They're talking about how women are more prone to this, even in the clinical descriptions. It's gross. But I could see a medical debt company being like, your eating disorder doesn't count because it's behavioral. I could see them doing that. Now, a clinician might be able to make the argument that it's a mental health condition, but
you can't make an argument that it's not a medical condition if it's in the ICD.
I agree with you.
So
But I could see the other side.
It doesn't matter what the label is. If it's there, you can't argue that it's
Right.
not a medical service.
And it was a healthcare service. It was paid for as a healthcare service. It was I agree. But I'm just pointing out, I see the other side too. And that this is the nature of this, is that the stigma is embedded in the very social construction of mental illness. It's kind of disgusting that, like, you know, we even would view an eating disorder as some behavioral problem and not look at why does a person have that condition? It's usually trauma. It's usually something happened, or sometimes it's a medical condition behind it, you know? So it can be so complicated, but I do see your point, which is that it's a healthcare service. If it's in here, we shouldn't have to say behavioral, but I see the other side. I feel torn because I could see a medical debt company saying to a vulnerable person, no, we're not taking this off. And then the person saying, I give up because they're so beaten down by the system. It's a rough spot.
I will also note that your collection agency and your credit reporting agency do not have access to your medical records or your ICD-10 or so that it's not as though things are reported to credit reporting agencies and they say this was for this condition and this was for this condition.
Oh,
What it does is it would allow, if somebody was trying to have it removed, they could make the argument of this is why I was seeing this provider and I incurred debt. And it would allow the credit reporting agency to say, well, we don't think that that's healthcare services. We think it's behavioral health. And Vermont has said nothing about ensuring that behavioral health is not on your credit report. It would just, and we're not talking about medical professionals here. I'm going to take a straw poll, I guess, on, I'm not sure if, is the question whether or not
Favorable.
who finds the amendment offered by Representative Donahue favorable? Or, and who finds the amendment unfavorable? Did you vote, Topper?
Yeah, I didn't
Oh,
have it up high enough.
wait.
I'm on the other side,
You're unfavorable or you're favorable?
favorable.
You're favorable to the amendment.
That's
Right.
fine.
Okay. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6, 5? 5, 6.
Would be like,
5, 6.
or you could say it was found unfavorable, 650.
Yeah.
Now the amendment unfavorable and a vote of 650.
Oh, dear. Great. Thank you.